"Sir, guests like you usually enter through the service hallway." The sentence drifted across the marble lobby just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, and within seconds, quiet laughter spread beneath the gold chandeliers of the Ashbury Grand Hotel. Rain hammered against the 40-foot glass windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan while Elijah Brooks stood near the entrance mat, water dripping slowly from the edge of his dark coat onto the polished white floor. His clothes looked old, not dirty, but worn in the way only long years could soften fabric. The cuffs of his sleeves had faded nearly gray, and the soles of his shoes bent slightly at the edges each time he shifted his weight. A young bellhop smirked as he rolled a silver luggage cart past him. Two women waiting near the elevators glanced at Elijah, then quickly looked away with uncomfortable smiles. Behind the front desk, Victoria Hale adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored blazer and stared directly at him with the cold expression of someone already certain about another person's worth. The Ashbury Grand catered to hedge fund managers, celebrities, and foreign diplomats. Crystal light reflected across polished brass columns. Soft piano music floated through hidden ceiling speakers. Every detail inside the hotel had been designed to make wealthy people feel separated from the rest of the world, and tonight, Elijah Brooks looked like a stain against that illusion. Victoria stepped away from the reception counter in 4-inch heels that clicked sharply against the marble floor. "Can I help you?" she asked, though her tone made it clear she hoped the answer would be no. Elijah removed his rain-soaked cap slowly and held it against his chest. "I'm here for a meeting," he said calmly. Victoria's eyes moved down toward the old leather envelope tucked beneath his arm. "A meeting?" she repeated with a faint smile. "With who?" Elijah glanced toward the private elevators near the back of the lobby. "The owner." A receptionist beside Victoria covered her mouth to hide a laugh. The security guard near the revolving door straightened slightly, already expecting trouble. Victoria folded her arms. "Sir, the owner doesn't meet walk-ins." Elijah nodded once, patient. "He asked me to come tonight." Another employee whispered something under his breath, and several people nearby chuckled louder this time. Outside, thunder rolled over the city while yellow taxi lights streaked across the wet Manhattan streets beyond the glass. Victoria lowered her voice, but not enough to hide the contempt inside it. "Look around," she said. "This hotel has standards." Elijah looked around exactly as she instructed. At the chandeliers. At the marble. At the guests dressed in tailored wool coats and diamond watches. Then he looked back at her with an expression so calm it almost unsettled her. "I know," he said quietly. Victoria Hale held Elijah's stare for several seconds before finally stepping back toward the reception desk. The faint smile on her face disappeared, replaced by the polished corporate calm she used whenever difficult guests threatened the atmosphere of the Ashbury Grand. "Sir, if you are waiting for someone, you may sit over there for a few minutes," she said, motioning toward a seating area near the windows, though her voice still carried the sharp edge of dismissal. Elijah nodded once and quietly walked across the lobby while several employees continued watching him with amused curiosity. His shoes made soft damp sounds against the marble floor, leaving faint traces of rainwater behind him. Outside, traffic crawled through the storm while sheets of rain blurred the glowing city lights into streaks of gold and white. Elijah lowered himself carefully into a leather chair beside the enormous glass wall overlooking Lexington Avenue. He placed the old leather envelope neatly on his lap and rested both hands over it as though protecting something fragile. Nearby, a little girl in a bright yellow sweater wandered away from her mother near the elevators, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one loose ear hanging sideways. She accidentally dropped it onto the polished floor before running ahead without noticing. Elijah leaned forward slowly, picked up the toy, and studied the torn stitching along the rabbit's ear. From the inside pocket of his coat, he removed a tiny silver sewing kit no larger than a wallet. The metal case looked old, scratched by years of use. With careful fingers, he threaded a needle and repaired the loose seam while the piano music drifted softly through the lobby. One of the younger receptionists noticed and frowned in confusion. "Why would he carry that around?" she whispered quietly. Elijah finished tying the thread just as the little girl returned searching for the toy with worried eyes. He handed it back gently. "Good as new," he said. The child smiled immediately and hugged the rabbit against her chest. Her mother thanked him warmly before hurrying toward the elevators, unaware of the silent tension surrounding the man who had helped her daughter. Across the lobby, Victoria watched the exchange for a moment before turning back toward a tablet filled with financial reports. Numbers glowed across the screen beside highlighted warnings about declining occupancy rates and emergency investor meetings. The Ashbury Grand had been losing money for nearly 18 months. Luxury tourists were disappearing. Corporate clients were pulling contracts. Rumors of bankruptcy had already begun circulating through Manhattan's hotel industry, though employees had not yet been told the full truth. Victoria rubbed her temple as another message appeared from the board demanding immediate answers before tomorrow morning. The pressure had hollowed her patience into something cold and brittle. She glanced once more toward Elijah sitting quietly beside the rain-covered windows. In her mind, people either belonged in places like the Ashbury Grand or they did not. Wealth announced itself through watches, tailoring, posture, and confidence. Everything about Elijah Brooks challenged the invisible rules she had trusted her entire career. Yet despite the whispers, the laughter, and the judgment pressing around him from every direction, Elijah remained calm beneath the chandelier light, his expression unreadable while thunder rolled low above Manhattan. The storm outside intensified as more black sedans pulled beneath the glowing entrance canopy of the Ashbury Grand. Valets hurried through the rain carrying umbrellas while wealthy guests stepped onto the marble lobby floor without ever touching the wet pavement outside. Expensive perfume mixed with the faint scent of polished wood and fresh lilies arranged beside the front desk. Victoria Hale moved quickly between employees, checking every detail with controlled precision because tonight mattered more than anyone in the building understood. At exactly 8 o'clock, members of the hotel's executive board were scheduled to arrive for a private emergency meeting on the 32nd floor. The future of the entire property depended on what happened during the next few hours. Victoria adjusted a silver name tag on one employee's jacket before noticing another staff member carrying towels too visibly across the lobby. "Not through the center," she said sharply. "Use the side corridor. Guests should not see operations." The employee apologized quietly and disappeared immediately. Victoria believed luxury depended on illusion. Wealthy clients did not pay thousands of dollars per night simply for rooms and service. They paid to feel separated from ordinary struggle. Every reflection in the marble, every flower arrangement, every smiling employee existed to protect that fantasy. Any crack in the image made her uneasy. Her phone vibrated again with another message from the board chairman asking whether tonight's investors had arrived yet. Victoria typed back a confident response she did not fully believe. Occupancy rates had fallen nearly 20% over the last year. International investors were hesitating. Several luxury chains had already offered buyout proposals. If tonight's negotiations failed, layoffs would begin before Christmas. She knew it. The board knew it. But the staff downstairs still smiled beneath crystal chandeliers as though the building itself could never collapse. Across the lobby, Elijah Brooks remained seated near the rain-covered windows, calm and silent while people continued staring at him from time to time. A pair of businessmen walking past slowed slightly when they noticed his worn coat. One of them muttered something under his breath before both continued toward the private bar. Elijah did not react. His attention drifted instead toward the piano player near the restaurant entrance. The musician was an older man with silver hair and tired shoulders. Halfway through a song, the pianist coughed hard into his sleeve and briefly lost rhythm. Elijah noticed immediately. When the song ended, he rose quietly from his chair and crossed the lobby. Several employees watched nervously, expecting another awkward interaction. Elijah approached the piano and placed a folded $20 bill beside the musician's glass of water. "Beautiful playing," he said softly. The pianist looked surprised. "Thank you," he replied. Not many people stopped to listen anymore. Elijah smiled faintly. Some things deserve patience. From the reception desk, Victoria observed the exchange with growing irritation. In her mind, Elijah's calmness felt almost disrespectful. Most people who were embarrassed in public either argued, left angrily, or apologized for existing in the wrong place. But Elijah Brooks behaved as though none of the judgment around him carried any weight at all. That unsettled her more than confrontation would have. Thunder rumbled above the city again while elevator doors opened near the lobby entrance. 3 board members stepped inside wearing tailored navy overcoats and carrying leather briefcases. Employees immediately straightened their posture. Victoria walked forward quickly with a polished smile, ready to protect the image of perfection she had spent years building, unaware that the quiet man near the piano already knew exactly how fragile that image truly was. The board members barely noticed Elijah Brooks as they crossed the lobby toward the private elevators, their attention buried inside urgent conversations about contracts, losses, and emergency financing. Victoria Hale followed closely beside them with a controlled smile that hid the pressure tightening inside her chest. One wrong impression tonight could cost her everything she had spent 10 years building. She pressed the elevator button and glanced back across the lobby once more. Elijah had returned to the leather chair near the windows, sitting quietly with the old envelope resting against his knee while rain crawled down the glass. Behind him in long silver streaks. The youngest board member, Richard Langford, stopped suddenly before entering the elevator. "Where is the updated acquisition report?" he asked. Victoria's expression tightened for half a second. "In the conference room upstairs," she answered smoothly. "I revised the numbers myself this afternoon." Richard frowned. "The overseas investors want confirmation before signing anything tonight." "They will have it," Victoria replied quickly. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, but before the executive stepped inside, Elijah's calm voice carried across the marble floor. "Your projections are inflated." Silence spread through the lobby almost instantly. Victoria turned slowly, disbelief flashing across her face. Several employees froze behind the reception desk. Richard looked toward Elijah with open confusion while the older board members exchanged irritated glances. Elijah rose from the chair and walked toward them with measured steps, the polished floor reflecting the chandelier light beneath his worn shoes. Victoria folded her arms tightly. "Excuse me?" she asked coldly. Elijah stopped several feet away. "The acquisition report," he said evenly. "The numbers are overstated by at least 12%. One of the receptionists laughed under her breath. Victoria stared at Elijah as though he had crossed some invisible boundary no ordinary person should even recognize. "Sir," she said carefully, "you have absolutely no understanding of what is being discussed here." Elijah's expression never changed. The renovation debt was rolled into projected revenue instead of operational loss, he continued calmly. That makes the hotel appear healthier than it actually is. Richard Langford blinked in surprise. The older executive beside him lowered his briefcase slightly. Victoria felt heat rise into her face. "Security," she called sharply without taking her eyes off Elijah. The guard near the entrance immediately started walking toward them. Several guests nearby slowed their conversations, sensing tension spreading through the elegant lobby. Elijah did not move. "Your investors will discover the discrepancy during due diligence. Anyway," he said quietly. "It is better to be honest before they do." Victoria gave a short laugh filled with disbelief. "A man sitting in my lobby wearing a coat from a thrift store is now giving financial advice to a billion-dollar property?" A few employees smiled nervously. Someone near the elevators whispered, "This cannot be real." The security guard approached Elijah cautiously. "Sir, I am going to need you to leave the property." Elijah looked toward Victoria instead. "You are afraid the truth will damage appearances," he said. "But appearances are already the problem." Victoria's jaw tightened. Rain battered the glass outside while thunder echoed low over Manhattan. The lobby suddenly felt smaller, heavier, as though the storm itself had drifted indoors. Richard slowly opened the tablet containing the acquisition report and glanced at the highlighted projections on the screen. His expression shifted almost immediately. "Wait," he murmured quietly. Victoria turned toward him. "Richard?" He looked back at Elijah with growing uncertainty. "How did you know about the restructuring debt?" he asked. Elijah lowered his eyes briefly toward the worn leather envelope in his hand before answering in the calmest voice anyone in the lobby had heard all night. "Because I approved it." For several long seconds, nobody in the lobby moved. The soft piano music near the restaurant entrance continued playing, but every conversation nearby faded beneath the heavy silence now hanging across the marble floor. Rain streaked down the enormous glass windows while Richard Langford stared at Elijah Brooks as though trying to place a face from a photograph he had forgotten years ago. Victoria Hale let out a quiet breath of disbelief before forcing a sharp smile back onto her face. "That is impossible," she said immediately. "The ownership group does not personally review restructuring reports." Elijah looked at her calmly. "The majority stakeholder does." One of the older executives stepped closer, studying Elijah more carefully now. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. Elijah slowly opened the weathered leather envelope he had carried all evening. Inside were several neatly organized documents stamped with the insignia of Brooks Capital Holdings. Even before he handed them over, Richard's expression changed completely. He recognized the logo instantly. The same company had quietly purchased controlling interest in the Ashbury Grand nearly 3 years earlier during a financial crisis that almost destroyed the hotel. Richard accepted the documents with slightly trembling hands and scanned the signature at the bottom of the first page. Elijah Brooks, Chairman and Principal Investor. The security guard standing beside Elijah immediately stepped backward. One receptionist covered her mouth in shock. Another employee nearly dropped a stack of reservation folders onto the counter. Victoria remained frozen beside the elevator doors, though the color had slowly drained from her face beneath the chandelier light. "No," she whispered quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Richard looked directly at her. "Victoria," he said carefully, "this is Mr. Brooks." The words landed across the lobby like shattered glass. Elijah did not smile. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there holding the envelope while the same people who had mocked him moments earlier suddenly avoided eye contact. One of the younger employees looked down at the marble floor in embarrassment. Another hurried silently toward the back office, desperate to disappear before being noticed. Victoria swallowed hard before stepping forward again, trying to regain control of the situation slipping through her hands. "Mr. Brooks," she began carefully, "if we had known you were arriving tonight, we would have prepared appropriately." Elijah's eyes rested on her for a long moment. "That is exactly the problem," he replied softly. The thunder outside seemed distant now, replaced by the quiet hum of elevator cables and air conditioning moving through the massive building. Richard continued reviewing the documents with growing concern. "The numbers really are overstated," he murmured toward Victoria. "The investors will see this immediately." Victoria turned toward him quickly. "I was trying to protect the negotiations," she said. "The board needed confidence tonight." Elijah shook his head slightly. Confidence built on appearance always collapses. Nobody answered him. Across the lobby, guests who had earlier ignored Elijah now stared openly, whispering among themselves as realization spread. The man they had mistaken for a homeless stranger was the owner whose decisions controlled every paycheck inside the building. Yet Elijah himself looked untouched by the revelation. He still wore the same rain-soaked coat. The same worn shoes. The same calm expression. Victoria finally lowered her voice. "I owe you an apology." Elijah glanced briefly around the lobby at the receptionists, the bellhops, the security guard, and the polished marble room that had judged him before hearing his name. "You were not insulting me," he said quietly. "You were insulting anyone who cannot afford to look wealthy." The silence that followed felt heavier than humiliation itself. No one laughed anymore. No one moved. Beneath the golden chandelier light of the Ashbury Grand, the illusion of superiority had cracked wide open, and every person standing there could suddenly see it. The lobby remained painfully quiet long after Elijah Brooks finished speaking. Even the employees behind the reception desk moved more carefully now, as though afraid the smallest sound might deepen the humiliation already hanging over the room. Rain continued sliding down the towering glass windows in slow silver streams while yellow taxi lights blurred across the wet streets outside. Victoria Hale stood motionless near the elevators, one hand still wrapped around her tablet though her fingers had loosened their grip. A few minutes earlier, she had controlled every inch of the room. Now she could barely meet Elijah's eyes. Richard Langford quietly instructed the other executives to continue upstairs without him. The board members obeyed without argument, stepping into the private elevator with tense expressions and lowered voices. As the doors closed, the soft chime echoed strangely through the lobby, leaving behind an almost sacred silence. Elijah slowly placed the documents back inside the worn leather envelope. The receptionist who had laughed earlier stared at the marble floor, her face flushed with embarrassment. Near the entrance, the security guard adjusted his jacket nervously before speaking in a low voice. "Mr. Brooks. I did not know." Elijah looked at him gently. "That is true," he answered. "You did not know." The words were calm, but somehow they carried more weight than anger would have. Across the room, the pianist resumed playing softly again, though slower this time, filling the heavy silence with low drifting notes. Victoria finally stepped forward. Her high heels no longer sounded sharp against the marble. They sounded uncertain. "I judged you the moment you walked through those doors," she admitted quietly. Elijah said nothing. Victoria glanced toward the rain outside before continuing. "I thought I was protecting this place." Elijah followed her gaze toward the storm-covered streets beyond the glass. "No," he replied softly. "You were protecting an image." The chandelier light reflected faintly across the wet floor between them. Employees nearby pretended to work while secretly listening to every word. Elijah rested one hand against the back of a leather chair, his old coat still damp from the rain. "My mother cleaned floors in this hotel for 14 years, he said after a long silence. Victoria looked up slowly. She used to enter through the service hallway downstairs because guests complained when they saw janitors in the lobby. His voice remained calm, but something deeper moved beneath it now, quiet and steady like distant thunder. One winter night, management sent her outside during a snowstorm because her uniform looked unprofessional near a wedding reception. Victoria's face tightened. Nobody nearby moved. Elijah lowered his eyes briefly toward the marble floor. She stood in the alley behind this building for 40 minutes waiting for her shift to end. Rain tapped softly against the glass. The pianist continued playing in the distance. After she passed away, Elijah continued, "I promised myself that if I ever had enough power to change places like this, I would." Victoria swallowed hard, her composure slowly collapsing beneath the weight of what she was hearing. Elijah looked around the massive lobby filled with gold light, polished stone, and carefully manufactured luxury. "But tonight," he said quietly, "I walked into my own hotel and watched people decide my worth before hearing my name." No one spoke after that. The silence spreading through the Ashbury Grand no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Outside, the storm over Manhattan finally began to weaken, and for the first time all evening, faint traces of city light pushed through the dark clouds beyond the towering glass windows. Richard Langford remained in the lobby long after the other executives had gone upstairs. He stood near the reception desk reviewing the financial documents again beneath the warm chandelier light while the rain outside softened into a quiet drizzle across Manhattan. Employees moved carefully now, speaking in whispers, their earlier confidence replaced by nervous silence. Elijah Brooks walked slowly toward the massive windows overlooking Lexington Avenue and stared out at the city glowing beneath the wet streets. Reflections of passing headlights drifted across the glass like moving rivers of gold. Behind him, Victoria Hale remained frozen beside the elevators, struggling to process how quickly the entire night had changed. Richard finally lowered the documents and looked toward Elijah with visible respect. The board believed Brooks Capital would send representatives tonight, he admitted quietly. No one expected you personally. Elijah kept his eyes on the city outside. That is why I came alone, he answered. Richard hesitated before asking the question now sitting heavily in everyone's mind. Why did you never tell anyone who you were? Elijah gave a faint smile that carried no pride inside it. Because people behave honestly when they believe you have nothing to offer them. The words settled heavily across the lobby. Victoria slowly looked up at him again. For the first time all evening, she was no longer seeing a stranger in worn clothing. She was seeing the man who had quietly rebuilt the Ashbury Grand from the shadows while allowing others to take public credit for saving it. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. You covered the pension losses during the pandemic, he said carefully. You protected payroll when investors wanted layoffs. Elijah nodded once. The staff deserved stability. One of the receptionists overheard the conversation and covered her mouth in shock. The young bellhop who had laughed earlier now stared at Elijah with wide eyes filled with shame. Richard continued speaking almost carefully now, as though uncovering pieces of a story no one had bothered to learn before tonight. You also funded the Employee Housing Assistance Program anonymously. Elijah remained quiet. Victoria's face slowly changed as realization deepened. For years, she had admired the mysterious investor behind Brooks Capital. Industry magazines called him brilliant, disciplined, impossible to predict. Executives across New York competed for meetings with him. Yet when he entered his own hotel wearing ordinary clothes and rain-soaked shoes, she had treated him like an inconvenience contaminating the lobby. The humiliation now pressing against her chest had nothing to do with money or status anymore. It came from understanding exactly what kind of person she had chosen to disrespect. Elijah finally turned from the windows and looked calmly across the enormous marble room. Luxury should never require cruelty, he said softly. Nobody interrupted him. A building becomes worthless the moment people inside it forget how to treat human beings. The pianist near the restaurant entrance stopped playing briefly, listening in silence like everyone else. Victoria took a slow breath before stepping forward again. I spent years trying to make this hotel look perfect, she admitted quietly. Elijah studied her face for a long moment. And somewhere along the way, he replied gently, you stopped seeing people. The words hurt more because they were true. Victoria lowered her eyes immediately. Around them, the carefully polished image of the Ashbury Grand suddenly felt fragile beneath the soft gold lights and towering ceilings. Employees who once feared losing prestige now feared something far deeper, the realization that they had failed a simple test of humanity. Outside, the storm clouds over Manhattan finally broke apart completely. Allowing pale moonlight to slip through the towering glass windows for the first time that night, washing silver light across the marble floor where Elijah Brooks quietly stood. The clock behind the reception desk passed 9:30 as the Ashbury Grand slowly settled into an uneasy quiet. Guests moved through the lobby more softly now, sensing that something important had shifted beneath the polished surface of the hotel. Employees who once carried themselves with effortless confidence now avoided looking directly at Elijah Brooks whenever they passed him. The storm outside had almost disappeared completely, leaving Manhattan glowing beneath fresh rainwater and silver reflections. Richard Langford finally closed the financial folder and exhaled deeply. The board is waiting upstairs, he said carefully. Elijah nodded once but did not move immediately. Instead, he looked toward the reception desk where Victoria Hale stood alone beneath the chandelier light. Her tablet remained untouched beside her hands. The perfectly controlled image she had spent years maintaining was gone now, replaced by exhaustion and regret she could no longer hide behind professionalism. Elijah walked slowly toward her across the marble floor. Every employee nearby grew still again. Victoria looked up as he approached, her eyes carrying the quiet fear of someone expecting punishment. "Mr. Brooks," she began softly, "I understand if you want me removed from my position." Elijah studied her for several seconds before answering. "Do you know why most people fail when they gain authority?" he asked calmly. Victoria lowered her eyes. "Because they stop listening." Elijah shook his head slightly. "Because they begin believing dignity must be earned." The words settled heavily between them. Nearby, the pianist resumed another slow melody while soft light reflected across the polished brass columns lining the lobby walls. Victoria swallowed carefully before speaking again. "I became obsessed with protecting appearances," she admitted. "I thought luxury meant controlling everything." Elijah glanced around the massive room. "Luxury should mean safety," he replied. "People should walk into a place like this and feel respected, whether they spend $50 or $5,000. Several employees quietly exchanged embarrassed glances after hearing him say it aloud. Elijah rested the worn leather envelope against the reception counter. "Tomorrow morning," he continued, "Human Resources will review every complaint involving discrimination against guests or staff." One receptionist quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Another employee looked down immediately, ashamed. Victoria accepted the words without argument. "I understand," she whispered. But Elijah surprised everyone when he continued speaking. "Some people will lose their jobs tonight," he said evenly. "Cruelty cannot lead hospitality." The security guard near the entrance lowered his head heavily. Elijah looked toward him briefly. "But not everyone who made mistakes deserves destruction." Victoria slowly looked up again, confused by the calmness in his voice. Elijah met her eyes directly. "I am not interested in revenge." The lobby remained silent except for the soft piano and the distant sound of tires moving through wet streets outside. "You humiliated me because you believed appearance reflected value," Elijah said quietly. "But if I destroy you now simply because I have power, then I become exactly what I came here to change." Victoria's composure finally cracked. Tears filled her eyes despite her attempt to remain professional. "Why are you showing me mercy after what I said to you?" she asked. Elijah glanced toward the rain fading beyond the glass windows. "Because someone once showed mercy to my mother when nobody else would." His voice remained soft and steady. "Kindness is the only reason I survived long enough to stand here tonight." Nobody in the lobby spoke after that. The employees who had laughed earlier now stood frozen beneath the chandelier light, listening to a man they had judged for his clothes teach them something no amount of wealth had ever taught before. And for the first time since Elijah Brooks entered the Ashbury Grand, the building finally felt less like a monument to status and more like a place where humanity still had a chance to exist. Morning sunlight poured through the towering glass windows of the Ashbury Grand, washing the marble lobby in soft gold instead of the cold reflections of last night's storm. Manhattan outside had returned to its usual rhythm. Yellow taxis moved through the streets below. Steam rose from subway grates along the sidewalks. People hurried beneath the bright sky carrying coffee cups and briefcases, unaware that inside the hotel, something far more important than business had changed overnight. The lobby felt quieter now. Softer. Employees spoke in respectful tones instead of rehearsed corporate smiles. Several workers who had ignored janitorial staff for years now greeted them by name while passing through the corridors. Near the reception desk, fresh flowers filled crystal vases with the faint scent of lilies and cedar. Victoria Hale stood alone behind the counter wearing a simple dark suit instead of her usual designer colors. Her expression looked calmer than it had the previous night, though traces of exhaustion still rested beneath her eyes. The review meetings had continued until almost dawn. Several employees responsible for repeated complaints involving discrimination had been dismissed before sunrise. Others received mandatory retraining and probation. The changes moved quickly through the building, but nobody argued. The atmosphere itself seemed different now, as though the hotel had finally been forced to look honestly at its own reflection. Near the entrance, the revolving doors turned slowly as Elijah Brooks stepped inside carrying a small paper coffee cup. Unlike the night before, no one stared at his clothes. No one whispered. The young bellhop who had laughed earlier immediately straightened and opened the interior door for him with genuine respect. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," he said quietly. Elijah nodded warmly. "Good morning." The security guard near the entrance also greeted him, his voice sincere this time instead of suspicious. Elijah returned the greeting without hesitation. Nothing in his face suggested bitterness. Across the lobby, Victoria noticed him enter and slowly walked from behind the reception desk. For a moment neither of them spoke. Sunlight reflected across the polished floor between them while the pianist near the restaurant entrance played a slow gentle melody almost hidden beneath the quiet sounds of morning conversation. Victoria looked toward the massive windows before finally speaking. "I walked through the employee hallway downstairs before my shift started today," she said softly. Elijah listened without interrupting. "I realized I had never actually seen most of the people working there." Elijah glanced briefly toward the service corridor near the back elevators. "Sometimes people become invisible when others decide they are beneath them," he replied calmly. Victoria nodded slowly, ashamed by how true the words felt now. Near the seating area by the windows, a little girl suddenly pointed excitedly toward Elijah while holding the stuffed rabbit he had repaired the night before. "Mommy, that is him," she whispered happily. The mother smiled warmly at Elijah from across the lobby. Elijah smiled back gently before walking toward the windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. Morning light spilled across his worn shoes and old coat, but now nobody saw poverty when they looked at him. They saw dignity. They saw patience. They saw a man who could have answered humiliation with cruelty and chose kindness instead. Elijah stopped beside the glass and looked out over the waking city while sunlight stretched across the marble floor behind him in long golden lines. Around him, employees moved with quieter voices and softer expressions, as though humanity itself had finally returned to the building. And in the peaceful silence of the Ashbury Grand, nobody needed to announce who truly belonged there anymore.